Hi everyone, welcome to another lecture. Last time we finished our 11th PowerPoint by discussing William H. Carney and how he actively kept the American flag flying um, during the 54th Massachusetts disastrous assault right on Fort Wagner. And he ended up being the first black man to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. So pretty big accomplishment. Then we began our 12th and final PowerPoint, which we will continue for the next several lectures, by discussing President Andrew Johnson, who took over when Lincoln was assassinated, and how he was impeached for actively going against Senate Republicans who wanted to punish the South as well as reconstruct it, but Johnson wanted to get the South back to normal immediately. We also discussed Special Field Order Number 15, or the first attempt at reparations for the black community, but unfortunately that 40 acres and a mule never came to pass. And finally, we discussed the Freedmen's Bureau, the government agency created by Lincoln specifically to help freedmen, women, and children to basically amalgamate themselves to American life, right? Um, and it was a hard process. They had to learn to read and write, get jobs, find their families, get married legally. There was a lot of stuff. So today, our first topic, we are going to continue along this same line because one of the Freedmen's Bureau's jobs was to make sure that black people had good jobs and to protect them from predatory white employers who may want to treat them sort of similarly to how they worked as slaves. Right here you can see a couple of kids working in a field. And if you take a look at video A, I'm getting ahead of myself, there's actually a story that a son of a sharecropper who worked in sharecropping with his family told in the 1930s, and so it's read by someone a lot closer to the time period we're in right now, but so you can actually hear the words of somebody who lived this type of lifestyle. So sharecropping became widespread in the South as a response to economic upheaval caused by the end of slavery during and after Reconstruction. Sharecropping is a way for very poor farmers, both white and black, to earn a living from land owned by someone else. The landowner provided land, housing, tools, and seed, and perhaps a mule, and a local merchant provided food and supplies on credit, right? So we've had the credit system for a long time, way before we've had credit cards. Basically, you establish records with the local store owner and say, hey, I'll pay you back over time. I need the supplies now, right? My grandmother used to do that in the 60s and 70s when she didn't have enough money. At harvest time, the sharecropper received a share of the crop from 1/3 to 1/2, with the landowner taking the rest. The cropper used his share to pay off his debt to the merchant. So basically, here's how it worked. The landowner had a huge parcel of land, maybe it was an old plantation in some cases. They would give you a small portion of that land, and that's your land, technically. You're renting it, you get to farm it and grow whatever you want. Now, when it comes time to harvest time, the average is around a quarter of your crop had to go to the landowner, right, as rent or taxes, whatever you want to call it. Now, what happens if your crop goes through a bad season, right? If something happens and you don't have a crop, well, then you still owe the landowner, right? So now you're in debt. Also, the landowner controlled where you bought your supplies, and normally you were charged much more for those supplies, but you were under contract. So this was what kept black families perpetually poor. But the reason why they signed up for this is because, remember, around 80% of slaves worked in the fields. So these free black people, most of whom used to be slaves, that's really the only skills that they have. So it made sense for them to want to do this type of work, but it ended up, shooting him in the foot, so to speak. The system started with blacks when large plantations were subdivided. By the 1880s, white farmers also became sharecroppers, so there were poor white people who were also taken advantage of in this system. The system was distinct from that of the tenant farmer who rented the land, provided his own tools and mule, and received half the crop. Landowners provided more supervision to sharecroppers and less or none to tenant farmers. Sharecroppers worked a section of the plantation independently, usually growing cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, and other cash crops, and receiving half of the parcel's output. Sharecroppers also often received their farming tools and all other goods from the landowner they were contracted with. As I mentioned, right, the landowner usually sold you your tools and would charge you more. Landowners dictated decisions relating to the crop mix, and sharecroppers were often in agreements to sell their portion of the crop back to the landowner, thus being subjected to manipulated prices, right? So even the crop that you didn't have to give the landowner, you ended up selling to them anyways, right? In addition to this, landowners, threatening to not renew the lease at the end of the growing season, were able to apply pressure to their tenants. Sharecropping often proved economically problematic, as the landowners held significant economic control. During the Reconstruction Era, sharecropping is one of the few options for penniless freedmen to support themselves and their families. Here's an example of a sharecropping family and one of their homes, or their home. During Reconstruction, the Federal Freedmen's Bureau ordered the arrangements and wrote and enforced the contracts. The Freedmen's Bureau was very involved in this process, yet black people were still very much taken advantage of. Though the arrangement protected sharecroppers from the negative effects of a bad crop, many sharecroppers, both black and white, remained quite poor. Okay, so that's sharecropping. Sharecropping pretty much lasted until about the 1940s, maybe you could say the 50s. But that's a long time for this system that takes advantage of people to be in full operation, right? This also left a large gap in wealth, right, in the black community. This is called generational wealth, right? So a lot of wealthy people are only wealthy because their families were wealthy before them, right? This is called generational wealth, where over time your family retains wealth, right? Property, money, different assets, all that stuff, and it's passed along, right? So you have a good head start. Well, the black community, if a lot of them were left poor, weren't given good jobs, were forced to live in rundown communities, weren't allowed to buy property, there's no generational wealth, and the black community starts off in life with a lot less than the white community. So that's an issue in our country. Right? So this is an example of a sharecropping couple, right, who have less than ideal conditions. Now, in addition to the jobs being kind of crappy, right, there were also laws put in place that I've mentioned in the last lecture that the South instituted in order to make sure that black people weren't going to be equal to them. And these were called the Black Codes. So this picture is a black family cowering. There's a KKK member. We'll talk about the Ku Klux Klan next time. And the White League, which was essentially the KKK, except they didn't cover their faces, right? Both were instituted in order to terrorize the black community into submission. So the Black Codes were laws passed by Southern states in 1865 and 1866 in the United States after the American Civil War, with the intent and the effect of restricting African Americans' freedom and of compelling them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. And if you take a look at video B, so Matthew McConaughey a few years ago starred in the movie Free State of Jones. I think this movie's still on Netflix, but who knows. So Free State of Jones is about a man from Texas who fights in the Civil War. During the Reconstruction Era, he helps freedmen to, basically stand up against their oppressors and helps them to vote. So in this clip, you'll see that Matthew McConaughey's character is leading a group of freedmen to the polling place, and you'll see how difficult it was for them to vote, right? And how their votes were ultimately not really counted. So please think about this, um, either when the next time you vote or when you get to the age where you can vote, right? Because some of you may not be 18 yet. Um, think about this when you think about whether you want to vote or not, because it was super hard for people to vote, and people really fought to get the vote. And it's not that hard now. So, black codes were essentially replacements for slave codes. Northern states such as Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and New York enacted black codes to discourage free blacks from residing in those states and denying them equal rights, including the right to vote, the right to public education, and the right to equal treatment under the law. So the slave codes back in the day were essentially, I kind of hinted at them in the past, but there were laws that basically were like, you can't have drum circles, you can't have your own gardens, things like that, right? Basically controlling the slaves, making sure that they didn't enjoy very many freedoms and that they remained subservient. The black codes were essentially the same thing, except, um, there weren't any slaves anymore, right? Of course, it's also important to note that the northern states did it too, right? The South isn't the only racist place in the United States. The North was very racist. They just get less credit for it because they fought against slavery, but that doesn't mean they weren't racist. Some of these northern black codes were repealed around the time that the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. Since the colonial period, colonies and states had passed laws that discriminated against free blacks. Remember, we talked about this before, how they wanted to get rid of or limit the rights of free blacks so they don't make the slaves feel like freedom is better. Okay, here's some men trying to register to vote. In the South, these were generally included in slave codes. The goal was to reduce influence of free blacks because of their potential influence on slaves, as I just mentioned. Restrictions included prohibiting them from voting, bearing arms, gathering in groups for worship, and learning to read and write. In the first 2 years after the Civil War, white-dominated Southern legislatures passed black codes modeled after the earlier slave codes. They were particularly concerned with controlling movement and labor, as slavery had given way to a free labor system. Okay, so this is important because they don't, even though they don't want black people to be equal to them, they created the Klan, they scared the shit out of black families and killed them in a lot of cases. They don't want black people to move away. The thing is, the Southern economy still depends on cheap labor, right? Which they still get from freed men, women, and children because they can pay them less because they can be racist about it, right? If all the black people picked up and left the South, the Southern economy would crash again, right? So the black codes also were meant to keep them in the South so that they could still collect money, taxes, all that stuff from them, but still oppress them. Okay. Although freedmen had been emancipated, their lives were greatly restricted by the black codes. The defining feature of the black codes was broad vagrancy laws, which allowed local authorities to arrest freed people for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor. So basically, like I always use this example, though I'm not sure if it was a vagrancy law. If you jaywalk across the street, which everybody does, but if you're a black person during this time, they could throw you in jail for like 20 years and make you work the whole time for free. Right? That's slavery. That's why I stress the 13th Amendment and that sticky little clause that said that involuntary labor can be used in the case of convicted crime, because then you have things like the vagrancy law and the prison industrial complex we have now, where prisoners work for hardly anything and are forced to do so. This period was the start of the convict lease system, also described as slavery by another name. Okay, and one of those was the chain gangs during that time, right? Everybody was chained together. They wore those striped outfits and they basically crushed rocks and worked on railroads and stuff like all day, every day. So this is where we get those type of systems. So if you take a look at video C, you'll see footage of some chain gangs from the 1930s. Feel free to flip around the video since I think it's like a half an hour long, so you don't need to watch the whole thing. So here are some examples of black codes. So the first one, employment was required of all freedmen. Violators faced vagrancy charges, so you could be thrown in jail for years if you couldn't find a job, right? Freedmen could not assemble without the presence of a white person because they feared that they would get together and plot something or whatever. This is like an old relic from slavery as well. Freedmen were assumed to be agricultural workers, and their duties and hours were tightly regulated. Freedmen were not to be taught to read or write. Okay, so in some cases you couldn't learn to read or write. Maybe they couldn't legally do that, but they would make sure that you didn't have public schools to learn that. Public facilities were segregated. Now, this is part of Jim Crow, which I talk about in modern Black history, right? This idea that you can't drink at the same water fountain as a white person, or you can't ride at the front of the bus, things like that. It started way before Rosa Parks refused to stand up from the bus and stuff, right? Violators of these laws were subject to being whipped or branded, so that's from the slave codes actually, but I included it here since they sort of are in line, right? Very, very interesting codes. Later on, these codes would be validated again into the Jim Crow era, in which everything was segregated through a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, where a biracial man refused to get up from a whites-only train car, and he took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that separate but equal was legal, meaning that you could segregate places, public places, legally. So zipping right through, right? Our next topic, we're going to talk about radical Republicans and how they fought to give Black people rights, right? They believed in helping freed men, women, and children. You could probably argue that they wanted to do that so they could get more votes for their party, right? It's very advantageous for this new voting bloc who has no experience for you to influence them to your side. This is an example of the first Black senator and several representatives in Congress, right? So for a while, Black people were elected because they got to vote and hold seats, although that would change after the Reconstruction period ended. Okay. So radical Republicans, right, generally held a lot of power from 1854 to 1877. If you take a look at the last video, because I don't have a video for the last topic, there's more info on the radical Republicans. So they call themselves radicals with the goal of immediate, complete, permanent eradication of slavery, right? This is before the Civil War, without compromise. So they're pretty much in line with William Lloyd Garrison, right, and his abolitionist society. Radicals led efforts after the war to establish civil rights for former slaves and fully implement emancipation. After weaker measures in 1866 resulted in violence against former slaves in the rebel states, radicals pushed the 14th Amendment and statutory protections through Congress. Okay, so basically, they saw that, the South was passing these black codes. They were, having, like maybe the KKK or other, sort of gangs, groups who were terrorizing Black people, so they worked to make sure that they could have citizenship and voting rights and things like that. They disfavored allowing ex-Confederate officials to retake political power in the South and emphasized equality, civil rights, and voting rights for the freed people. The Radicals passed their own Reconstruction plan through Congress in 1864, but Lincoln vetoed it and was putting his own presidential policies in effect by virtue as military commander-in-chief when he was assassinated in April 1865. So the radical Republicans actually wanted more comprehensive measures for the Reconstruction era, but I think Lincoln wanted to not push away the South too much, right? We were still kind of wishy-washy with them, and he ultimately, remember, Lincoln's goal was to bring the South back. So Lincoln did not necessarily want to go with the radical Republicans because he felt that they would push the Southerners away. Radicals pushed for the uncompensated abolition of slavery, while Lincoln wanted to pay slave owners who were loyal to the Union. Right? Radical Republicans ended up winning on that regard. They keenly fought United States President Andrew Johnson, a former slave owner from Tennessee who favored allowing Southern states to decide the rights and status of former slaves. Okay, so yes, at one point I forgot to mention that Andrew Johnson did own slaves. After Johnson vetoed various congressional acts favoring civil rights for former slaves, they attempted to remove him from office through impeachment, which they failed again in 1868. So the radical Republicans were really the ones who pushed for Johnson's impeachment, although they failed in the Senate. But essentially, what we should understand here is that the radical Republicans were not afraid to, really go for it, really go for Reconstruction, for abolishing slavery, things like that. If you thought of them in a modern context, you'd probably think of them as like the more progressive liberals, like the progressive Democrats who believe in social programs for everybody, programs against climate change, things like that. Sort of on the left of the spectrum. And here we go. This says the last speech of impeachment, Thaddeus Stevens, closing the debate in the House. So the previous picture was of Thaddeus Stevens. He was one of the foremost people who called for Johnson's impeachment. Okay, and here he is delivering a speech imploring everybody to impeach that guy. So the last thing that I want to talk about is citizenship, right? Something that Black people had fought for years, right? Freed Black people did not really get to enjoy it. Citizenship, they were denied it. And what's important about citizenship is not only that you are a legal citizen in the United States, entitling you to the rights and securities of this country, but also that you get to vote, right? And that you get to serve on juries, meaning that you get to, help determine the case of somebody else. So super important. So for our last topic, right here is an example of the 14th Amendment. The previous picture was basically an ID card, right? Because we didn't have the ID cards that we have now. So the 14th Amendment was adopted on July 9th, 1868 as one of the Reconstruction Amendments. Arguably one of the most consequential amendments to this day. The amendment addresses citizenship rights and equal protection of the laws and was proposed in response to issues related to former slaves following the American Civil War. So this is important to recognize. Equal protection of the law is important too, right? Under the 14th Amendment, every citizen of the United States must be equally treated. Now, I always ask my students, do you think people were equally treated after this amendment was passed? And all of them say no, right? Which I'm glad we agree, because they weren't. But according to the law, everybody's supposed to be equal. The amendment was bitterly contested, particularly by the states of the defeated Confederacy, which were forced to ratify it in order to regain representation in Congress. So basically what Congress said was, to the Southern leaders, they're like, if you don't pass this amendment, we're not going to allow you back into the government. So they said, fine, whatever, right, and passed it. The amendment, particularly its first section, is one of the most litigated parts of the Constitution, forming the basis for landmark decisions such as Brown versus Board of Education regarding racial segregation. So that clause, right, equal protection of the law, that's why this is one of the most argued cases in our country's history, right? Litigation means that when you go to court, right, you use past cases, laws, amendments, examples in order to prove that in the legal system your case should go your way, right? So the 14th Amendment has been used for a bunch of stuff, right? Gay marriage, disability rights, civil rights, all that has been used. And of course, Brown versus Board, again, was the end of segregation in the school systems. The Citizenship Clause provides a broad definition of citizenship, nullifying the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, which again held that African descendants could not be citizens, right? So not only are black people not property, right, because they're no longer slaves, but also black people are citizens, so that denial of their citizenry no longer applies. The Due Process Clause prohibits state and local governments from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without fair procedure, but the Jim Crow era would basically ignore that. The Equal Protection Clause requires each state to provide equal protection under the law to all people, including all non-citizens, which, again, today many states forget that, within its jurisdiction. This clause has been the basis for many decisions rejecting irrational or unnecessary discrimination against people belonging to various groups. And again, that's why it's used the most in our law system, right? Usually people are like, oh, 14th Amendment, I'm not treated equally, right? And this is what the amendment says. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just read section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So basically what we just went over. So that's it for today, right? Next time we are going to, of course, continue with the Reconstruction period, right? We only have a couple more lectures. So next time we're going to talk about violence against black people, when they got their voting rights, stuff like that. Okay. So yeah, we're almost done with the class. The final's coming up soon. I hope you guys are really trying to retain the information and study, and yeah.